In May 2026, Donald Trump flew to Beijing on Air Force One, but he wasn't alone. Sat alongside him was Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Jensen Huang, and a handful of other executives worth close to $1 trillion combined. Think about that for a second. The most powerful man in America, with the most powerful companies in America, flying to China to make a deal. Beijing didn't fly to Washington. Washington flew to Beijing. And that got me thinking. This one image breaks the entire story we've been told. Because for years, headlines have screamed America versus China, with Trump making big swings and China being backed up against the ropes. But while America's been throwing punches, China's been playing a completely different game. A long game, with 5 moves, and they're already on move 4. So let me show you exactly how China is winning a war that most people don't even realize has started, why every single tariff Trump throws actually makes China stronger, and what all this means for your job, savings and future over the next 10 years. Because the era of America calling the shots might already be over. Have you ever watched a fight where one guy is throwing massive haymakers while the other guy is just calmly stepping out of the way and controlling the fight? Well, that's roughly what the trade war between China and the US looks like right now. And to understand why, I need to take you back to 2018. Back then, during Trump's first term as president, he slapped tariffs on around $360 billion worth of Chinese goods. And the entire world stood holding their breath, expecting China to crack. The theory was that if you hit China hard and fast enough, they'll eventually fold. The result of this was actually pretty interesting, because in one sense, the tariffs worked and Chinese exports to America did go down. The data is very clear on that. But Chinese exports overall, well, they hit record highs. I know it sounds crazy, but China decided to get clever and started rerouting goods. So a pair of trainers that used to ship straight from a factory in Guangzhou to a warehouse in Ohio now suddenly leaves Guangzhou, makes a quick stop in Vietnam where it gets repackaged and then ships to Ohio anyway. For Trump, it's basically like trying to stop water with a fork. The water just goes straight round. It's the same product, same workers, and same profits going back to Beijing. Just a different label on a box. So if we fast forward to October 2025, Trump's back in the White House, and China announced a new round of export controls on rare earth minerals. These are the minerals that go into pretty much everything modern, like your phone, car, F-35 fighter jets and the satellites in space. It's pretty important stuff, so Trump responded in the only way he knows how, threatening 100% tariffs on China starting November the 1st. And you could almost hear the markets gasp. Within 2 weeks, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced a framework deal at the ASEAN summit. The 100% tariffs disappeared. China agreed to delay its rare earth licensing regime by a year. Both sides shook hands, smiled for the cameras, and everyone went home. This is actually where the TACO meme comes from, because TACO stands for Trump always chickens out. And the pattern is now so reliable that traders on Wall Street actually use it as a trading signal. When Trump announces a tariff, the market dips, and the traders quietly start buying the dip because they've learned to expect the walk back within a few weeks. And honestly, every time it happens, it just confirms to Xi Jinping that his strategy is working perfectly. And this is where China, playing the long game, starts to show itself, because Trump's tariffs don't actually hurt China in the way he thinks they do. And in reality, all they do is hurt America. Because when you put a 100% tariff on a Chinese product, the Chinese factory obviously doesn't pay that tariff, and the cost is passed on to the American importer, who then passes it on to consumers. This then causes political pressure to build up inside America. Prices rise, voters start complaining, and Trump has no choice but to back down. China didn't even have to do anything. The tariffs just collapsed under their own weight. And that's the genius of Move 1, because on the surface, it looks like Trump is the aggressor and China is the defender. But really, China is baiting Trump into a fight on purpose, because they know exactly how the fight ends. And honestly, this is what the Chinese mean when they joke about Trump being a nation builder. Now, this might sound like they think he's making America strong. However, when they say nation builder, they mean helping to build China. Because every tariff round, trade dispute and panic in the market gives China another reason to invest in its own factories, technology and supply chains. If you think about it, America's hostility is literally what's funding China's independence. But this whole strategy only works if China owns something that America genuinely can't live without. Because if you've got nothing the other side needs, your leverage is essentially zero. So what does China actually own? And why can't America just replace it? Imagine for a second that you run the only water well in a town of 50,000 people. You didn't build the town or promise anyone water, you just happen to own the only working tap. How much leverage do you have in this situation? The answer is basically infinite. Because every single person, business and politician in the town needs what you have, and there's no alternative. That is essentially what China has become for the modern economy, except instead of one well, they own a dozen, and most of them are wells America didn't even realise it was drinking from. Let me walk you through a few of them quickly, because once you see them all stacked together, you start to realise how powerful China is actually becoming. First is rare earth minerals. China mines roughly 60% of the world's supply, refines about 90% of it, and manufactures around 94% of the magnets that depend on them. These materials sit inside your iPhone, electric car, the F-35 missile guidance systems, wind turbines, MRI machines, and basically every advanced piece of technology built in the last 30 years. Second is batteries. China produces roughly 80% of the world's lithium-ion batteries, and the two giants, CATL and BYD, dominate everything from the battery in your laptop to the battery in your Tesla. Third is solar panels. China makes more than 80% of the world's supply. And if you've installed solar panels on your roof anywhere in the world over the last decade, there's a very strong chance that the panels came from a factory in the Jiangsu province. Fourth is electric vehicles. BYD, the Chinese car manufacturer, just took over Tesla as the world's #1 electric vehicle seller. In 2025, BYD sold 2.26 million battery-powered cars, while Tesla delivered 1.64 million. And it's not just BYD. China as a whole is now the #1 car exporter on the planet, bigger than both Japan and Germany. And fifth is shipbuilding. This one is borderline unbelievable. China builds more than 53% of the world's commercial ships, while the United States builds about 0.1%. To put that into perspective, China delivered 972 commercial ships, and the US delivered 7. China's state-owned shipbuilding corporation alone produced more commercial vessels by tonnage in 1 year than the US has produced since the end of World War II. And these aren't accidents. In 2015, China's State Council announced a plan called Made in China 2025 and set out 10 strategic industries that China was going to dominate by the year 2025, with the goal of reducing its reliance on foreign tech and making China self-sufficient in the industries that matter most. Most Western analysts at the time waved it off as political theatre, just a slogan, or should we say propaganda? But this year, the Rhodium Group, one of the most respected Chinese research firms in the world, published their decade-long review of the plan, stating that Beijing achieved clear, undeniable progress. And the South China Morning Post calculated that China hit roughly 86% of its goals. It's clear this wasn't just a slogan, it was more of a delivery plan. And while America was busy arguing about tax cuts and culture wars, China was quietly executing their plan. Out of all these things, rare earth minerals are by far the most important. And when China was backed into a corner, they used this choke point to their advantage. Because America genuinely can't replace rare earth refining capacity in less than about 10 years. You can't just snap your fingers and build a refinery, because you need permits, land, environmental approvals, engineers, billions of dollars, and most importantly, time. America has all of those things in theory, but in practice, it has none of them at the scale required. So when China puts the brakes on rare earth mineral exports, America's entire defense industry, EV industry, and consumer electronics industries start to feel it. So Trump has to fold, because there's no other option. This is where Move 1 and Move 2 click together like pieces of a puzzle. The tariffs hurt America more than China, because America itself built the dependency over 30 years of cheap globalization. Every CEO is chasing lower costs and higher margins. Every politician is promising lower prices to voters, and every consumer wants cheaper TVs. So it's clear China has real hard leverage. The question is, what are they actually doing with it? If you've ever watched the Avengers Infinity War, there's a part in the film where you start to think Thanos actually has a point, and maybe the world would be better without half the population. The villain doesn't always have to win by force. Sometimes they can do it by convincing others that they're actually the good guy. Well, that's basically China's third move. The framing that most Western media uses for this story is America versus China. Two big powers, one global ring, and only one can win. It really does make for great headlines. But the framing is completely wrong, because most of the world isn't actually picking a side, and instead they're hedging their bets. Because under Trump's unpredictability, China gets to play the calm, stable, predictable partner. Which, if you think about it, is a wild thing to say given everything we know about the Chinese Communist Party. But that's the position they're playing. If you don't know what I mean by most of the world is hedging, let me show you what it looks like in practice. Europe, so Germany, France, Spain, etc., are sending their top political and business leaders to Beijing in numbers we haven't seen in years. They still publicly back the US, they still go to NATO meetings, but quietly, in the background, they're building a plan B. Because they've watched American foreign policy whiplash from administration to administration, and they've concluded that they can't put all their eggs in one basket. The Middle East, so Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have joined the BRICS alliance and are buying enormous amounts of Chinese technology and having active discussions about pricing some of their oil in Chinese yuan instead of the US dollar. These are countries that for 50 years were essentially America's clients. Now they're optimizing for their own interests, and China is happily showing up with cash and infrastructure, such as something called the Gold Corridor, which we'll get into a bit later. Then there's Africa. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has built ports, railways, fibre optic cables, and power plants across more than 40 African nations. Essentially, when an African leader picks up the phone and asks for $1 billion infrastructure loan, they don't call Washington, they call Beijing. And don't think they're doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. They know Africa is the next big gold mine, and they're making sure that they're in debt to China. Latin America is another one. Lithium deals in Argentina, copper deals in Chile, soybean deals in Brazil, and port deals in Peru. The Chinese have become the largest trading partner for most of South America. So they're essentially taking over America's backyard. And then there's the part of this that's most underappreciated, because it's not just goods that China is exporting, it's something they call the digital Silk Road. Basically, they're exporting 5G networks, surveillance cameras, payment systems, smart city infrastructure, and even underlying cloud systems that countries use to run their governments. Once a country installs Chinese 5G or Chinese payment rails, the switching cost to remove them is massive. It's kind of like the foundations of your house. It's pretty hard to change them unless you knock the whole thing down and start again. And that's basically the point. Once you're locked in, you're locked in. That brings me back to May 2026 when Trump flew to Beijing. He was the first US president to visit China in nearly a decade. But remember, he wasn't alone. On that plane with him was Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Larry Fink, and other executives from Meta, Goldman Sachs, the list goes on. Combined, the CEOs on that plane control multiple tens of trillions of dollars. Now, think about what this actually means. The most powerful companies on the planet flew to Beijing with the President of the United States to negotiate. Not the other way round. Beijing didn't fly to Washington. Washington flew to Beijing. That's what a slow rebalancing of the world order looks like. It doesn't come with tanks or speeches, it comes with billionaires on private jets. However, there's still one thing that America can do that nobody else on the planet can match. America can weaponize the dollar by freezing your assets, blocking your banks, kicking you out of SWIFT, and crush your economy without firing a single bullet. So what is China doing about that? Well, they're building a workaround. Okay, this is the part of the video where you might want to grab a coffee, because we're about to wander into the most important shift happening in global finance right now, and almost no mainstream news outlet is covering it properly. For the last 50 years, the US dollar hasn't just been a currency, it's been a system. Oil priced in dollars meant every country on earth needed dollars. Every country needing dollars meant they were forced to hold US treasuries, and them holding US treasuries meant America could run up massive debts. Year after year, and the world would politely fund them. That arrangement is called the petrodollar system, and it's the single most important reason the US has been able to run the world economy on its own terms since the 1970s. But that foundation is starting to crack in a few different ways. Let me bring you up to speed. Firstly, China's cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, processed roughly 180 trillion yuan in 2025, which works out to about 25 trillion US dollars. Then in March 2026, CIPS hit a single-day record of 1.22 trillion yuan, which is about $178.5 billion in 24 hours. CIPS is basically China's version of SWIFT, and the volume is growing at a ridiculous rate. Then there's a cross-border digital currency project called mBridge, which connects the central banks in China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. It's processed over $55 billion in cross-border transactions, and around 95% of those transactions were settled in digital yuan. The Bank for International Settlements actually pulled out of this project in late 2024, which was a huge moment most people missed, because it revealed that this is now a Chinese-led system, not a neutral global one. Countries around the world are becoming increasingly more confident in yuan, so much so that India bought roughly 60 million barrels of Russian crude oil in March 2026 alone, and a significant share of those purchases were settled in yuan instead of dollars. And that right there is the foundation of the petrodollar system starting to wobble. China now has more than 40 bilateral yuan swap lines with central banks around the world. A swap line is basically an agreement that says if our economies hit a crisis, we'll lend each other our currencies. And then there's gold, which is honestly one of the craziest parts of this whole story. China has been the largest official central bank buyer of gold for years now. They don't talk about it much. The figures only get reported once a quarter, and they often understate them. So why is China buying so much gold? That's the million-dollar question. Well, in order for other countries to use your currency, they first have to trust what's backing it. As we all know, the US dollar is currently the world's reserve currency, and after President Nixon ended the gold standard in 1971, the dollar became backed largely by trust in the US government and the economy. However, because of China's political system and concerns some countries have around government control and transparency, Chinese leaders know that many nations won't automatically trust the government alone as the foundation of their currency. As a result, they're looking at history and exploring ways to increase confidence in yuan by building up massive gold reserves and expanding gold-related financial infrastructure. Part of this strategy involves what's often referred to as a gold corridor, a network of gold vaults and settlement hubs being developed across China and other BRICS-aligned regions. The goal is to make gold a bigger part of the international trade and financial settlement while giving countries an alternative to the dollar-based system. Does this mean the yuan is going to replace the dollar tomorrow? Of course not. The dollar still dominates global trade, central bank reserves and international finance. But China's gold buying spree does show that it's thinking long term and positioning itself for a world where the dollar may not be quite as dominant as it is today. China still has strict capital controls, the yuan isn't freely convertible, and BRICS isn't about to launch a single unified currency. But replacement isn't actually the goal. Optionality is. I mean, think of it like this. Imagine that the world only had one type of electrical socket and it was American, but now China is installing a second socket in every country. The American socket still works and it also is still the most powerful. But next time America tries to cut off someone's power, that country can just plug into the other socket and keep going as usual. That changes absolutely everything, because the dollar's nuclear weapon, the ability to crush any country by cutting them off, only works if the country has no plan B. So now China has leverage, allies and a financial backdoor. The board is set. Beijing seems to have a winning position. So why hasn't Xi Jinping made his big move yet? Well, that's because the final move is the most powerful one of them all, and it costs absolutely nothing. There's a story that comes to mind here, and I know it could be entirely made up, but it captures something very important. A Western journalist once asked a senior Chinese official what they thought of the French Revolution that happened in 1789. The official paused, thought for a second and said, "It's too soon to tell." Now, whether or not that conversation happened is debatable, but the mindset behind it is definitely real. China measures time differently than the Western world does because American politicians think in election cycles, CEOs report quarterly earnings, voters follow news cycles, all the while China measures in decades. Xi Jinping has a target date that he and the Communist Party openly talk about. It's 2049, which is the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. By that year, China intends to be the undeniable leading economic and military power on the planet. That gives them a 23-year runway from where we are right now. Trump's timeline, on the other hand, is about 3.5 years because after January 2029, he's out. And whoever comes next will be a completely different player with a completely new agenda who might rip up everything Trump has done and start again. So if you're Xi and you're looking at the chessboard, why on earth would you make a big risky move now? Because you don't have to. You can literally just sit and wait. Made in China 2025 was actually only stage 1 of a 3-stage 30-year plan. Stage 2 has already been published. It's called Made in China 2035, and it focuses on becoming a global leader in advanced industries. And stage 3, which ends in 2049, is about cementing China's leadership in basically every major technology category. While America is fighting over who gets to be Speaker of the House this month, China has its next 23 years already mapped out on the wall. There's a concept in international relations called the Thucydides trap. It's basically the idea that when a rising power challenges a falling power, war usually follows. Both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump know about this. Both sides desperately want to avoid it, and the rising power, China, has figured out they don't actually need to beat America. They just need to outlast America's patience. This is where Taiwan fits into the picture, because most people think Taiwan is going to be the breaking point between China and the US. They think China is about to invade, Trump is about to defend, and the whole thing is going to blow up into World War III. But Xi knows an outright invasion of Taiwan would trigger exactly the war that costs him everything he's built. Sanctions, supply chain issues, lost allies, the whole playbook would unravel overnight. So instead, China plays what military analysts call the grey zone. Whether it's Chinese fishing fleets in Taiwanese waters, Chinese Coast Guard inspections of Taiwanese ships, air defense zone incursions, blockade rehearsals or cyber attacks, the point is not to start a war today. It's to normalize Chinese presence around Taiwan so that by 2035 or 2045, when the political situation changes, reunification feels like a formality rather than a military operation. It's kind of like when you're a kid and you push the boundaries with your parents to see how much you can get away with, and each time you get away with a little bit more. Every Trump tariff that gets walked back, every CEO that flies to Beijing, every European leader that goes to Shanghai, all of it confirms to Xi that the clock is on his side. He just has to keep the system running until the calendar does the work for him. But there is a fair counter-argument to all of this, and I do think it's important to stay balanced. If America actually had a long-term coordinated strategy that both major political sides stuck to for decades, it could absolutely beat China's approach. The US still has huge strengths like the deepest financial markets in the world, top universities, the most revolutionary companies, and by far the strongest military. None of that disappears quickly, but the words long-term and coordinated don't really describe how US politics work today. And that's exactly what Xi Jinping is counting on. So if the US don't get their long-term strategy on point, they're going to fall victim to China's dominance, right? Well, maybe not, as there's some major weaknesses built into China that we haven't discussed yet. And that weakness might be what ends up protecting the West. Okay, so if I left the video here, I'd be doing you a disservice, because every other China is winning YouTube video does exactly that. They scare you, impress you with the stats, and make you think the Western world is finished. But that's not the real story, because China has 7 big cracks. Let me walk you through them. Crack 1 is demographics. In 2025, China recorded its lowest birth rate since 1949 when the country was founded. Just 7.92 million babies were born last year, which means by 2050, China's population could shrink by as much as 250 million people. That's almost the entire population of America just gone. Think about what this actually means in practice. The workforce that has built this entire strategy is slowly disappearing. The factories that powered Made in China 2025 are going to be running with fewer workers, and the pension system is being squeezed from both ends with more old people drawing benefits and fewer young people paying in. We're already seeing this play out in the UK, as I mentioned in one of my last videos. Crack 2 is property. Evergrande, the giant developer that defaulted back in 2021, was just the first one to collapse. Country Garden followed, and trillions of dollars of bad property debt are sitting on Chinese books. Half-built apartment blocks dot the landscape across the country, and entire ghost cities have been built that nobody actually lives in. There's some amazing YouTube videos of people visiting these places, and it's astonishing that they're just left doing nothing. For the average Chinese family, where most household wealth is tied up in property, this is genuinely terrifying for them. Crack 3 is local government debt. Estimates put the combined explicit and hidden debt of Chinese local governments at somewhere between 18 and 20 trillion. I mean, that's a number so big that it doesn't really even make sense to most people. These local governments have historically funded themselves by selling land to property developers, and when the developers stop buying, the funding model collapses. Crack 4 is deflation. Most Western economies right now are fighting inflation, which is what happens when prices are rising. China, on the other hand, has the opposite problem. Their consumers are so anxious about the future that they're not spending at all. It's basically started a doom loop. Prices are flat or falling, which means businesses can't raise prices and grow profits. Therefore, they can't hire, leading to workers feeling more anxious and spending even less. Crack 5 is youth unemployment. The official figure right now is around 16%, which is high but somewhat manageable. However, the unofficial estimates, and the reason Beijing briefly stopped publishing this data back in 2023 when it hit 21%, are significantly worse. There's a generation of well-educated young Chinese people who are graduating university and finding there are no jobs waiting for them. And some of them are taking to social media to describe themselves as the rotten youth, which is a phrase that didn't exist in Chinese society 10 years ago. Crack 6 is excess capacity. China is now producing so many electric vehicles, solar panels and steel girders that their domestic market just can't absorb them, so they dump them overseas, which triggers backlash from the EU, Brazil, India and even some African countries who used to be friendly. And Crack 7 is capital flight. Foreign companies are quietly de-risking, and multinationals that built factories in China 15 years ago are now diversifying into Vietnam, India and Mexico. The Chinese stock market has had years of underperformance, and a lot of wealthy Chinese citizens are moving their money out of the country. So here's the question that should really make you think. If any one of these cracks will be enough to crush a smaller country, can the Chinese strategy actually survive all of them at once? And the honest answer is, maybe not. China has real problems, and those problems aren't going away anytime soon. But there is a trade-off for America. China's cracks decay slowly. Like, for example, demographics take 20 years to show up in GDP, and property debt takes a decade to grind through the system. America's political will, on the other hand, decays in months. It only takes a new election, scandal or distraction, and the whole strategic picture changes overnight. That is the bet that Xi Jinping is making. He's betting that his structural problems take longer to break China than America's political problems take to break America. But let's forget who wins for now, because the much more useful question is, what does all of this mean for you, your job and your money over the next 10 years? So look, I'll be the first to admit that learning about geopolitical chess is interesting, but let's be real, it doesn't pay your mortgage. So let me give you 5 things to watch closely over the next decade. None of this is financial advice, as I'm not a financial advisor, but I'm speaking from the experience of becoming a self-made millionaire. And trust me, understanding these patterns puts you in the driver's seat when it comes to creating and preserving wealth. Firstly, pay close attention to inflation. A weakening dollar plus supply chain shocks and tariffs all push prices up. Anyone telling you this round of inflation is just going to be transitory and disappear by next year is, in my opinion at least, not reading the chessboard correctly. This is structural pressure, and that has implications for everything you buy and the value of the money sitting in your savings account. Secondly, watch hard assets. When the currency you save in is slowly being weakened against gold, the natural thing that happens is gold, real estate and productive companies tend to hold their purchasing power better than cash sitting in a bank account. Historically, in situations like this, asset owners are the people who keep up with the cost of living, while cash savers fall more and more behind. Thirdly, keep an eye on the K-shape. Right now, the economy is splitting in two. Asset owners are pulling ahead and wage earners are getting squeezed. The next decade is going to reward people who can move from being purely a wage earner to also being some kind of asset owner. That might be through stocks, property or cash flowing businesses. That's exactly why you need to learn how to become something called a digital architect who positions their online skills in a way that's valuable to businesses that either makes them more money, saves them money or saves them time. I'm teaching you exactly how to do this in a free online event very soon so that you can separate yourself from the wage earners and build an online business that uses AI to its full potential. I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested. Fourthly, pay close attention to the jobs market. The combination of AI and tariff costs is going to brutally reorganize the American labor market over the next decade. Some sectors are likely going to boom, like defense, energy, manufacturing, and skilled trades. Other sectors are going to get hollowed out, like generic white-collar work and anything that can be easily replicated by AI. If you're under 35 and trying to figure out where to bet your career, those labour shifts are worth thinking about. And lastly, be careful about the information you consume. Both sides of this story are going to gaslight you. The American media has its own narrative about China's collapse, and the Chinese media has its own narrative about the American decline. Most of what you read on social media is going to be exactly the same, or at least similar to one of those two narratives, and most of it will be wrong. You don't have to pick a side here or root for your country to win. You just have to understand that the era of cheap, stable, predictable globalization is ending, and the next decade is going to reward the people who saw it coming. Most people won't, but after making it to the end of this video, you certainly will. If you want to understand why the US economy hasn't collapsed yet, then I'm going to leave that video right up there, but don't click on it just yet. Make sure to subscribe if you want to stay ahead of everyone else, okay? I'll see you over there.